Montana Territory, 1871. The wind cut like a knife as Virginia Blackwell stepped down from the stagecoach, her once elegant boots sinking into the frozen mud. 6 weeks ago, she had been sipping tea from fine china in her father's Albany mansion. Now she stood in the middle of nowhere, her breath coming in ragged white puffs, clutching a suitcase that held all that remained of her former life. Silverton wasn't a town so much as a few sorry buildings huddled together against the endless Montana winter. A lopsided saloon with a broken window, a general store with peeling paint, and a sheriff's office that looked like it hadn't seen a lawman in months. The few people on the street glanced at her with the kind of curiosity reserved for strangers, and the kind of suspicion reserved for women traveling alone. Ginny pulled her cloak tighter, feeling the weight of the newspaper clipping in her pocket. Cook wanted. Remote ranch. No questions asked. It had been her last hope. The stagecoach driver dumped her trunk unceremoniously into the mud. End of the line, miss. She opened her mouth to ask for help, but he was already climbing back onto his seat, slapping the reins before her words could form. The wheels churned up dirty snow as the coach lurched away, leaving her standing there like forgotten luggage. A shadow moved near the saloon. A man stepped forward, his boots crunching on the icy ground. He was taller than any man she'd known back east, with shoulders that strained against his worn coat. His face was all sharp angles and rough edges, like the mountains looming behind the town. But it was his eyes that caught her, dark as river stones, watching her with quiet intensity. You the one answering the ad? His voice was low, roughened by weather and years of silence. Ginny lifted her chin. Virginia Blackwell. They'll most call me Ginny. Reed Colter. He didn't offer his hand. His gaze traveled from her carefully pinned hair to her impractical gloves, lingering on the smooth, unmarked skin of her wrists. These were not the hands of a working woman. The silence stretched between them, broken only by the distant cry of a crow. Somewhere in the town, a door slammed shut. I can cook, Ginny said quickly, too quickly. The lie burned her tongue. Back home, their cook had chased her from the kitchen with a wooden spoon whenever she tried to help. Reed's expression didn't change. He turned toward a battered wagon hitched to 2 sturdy workhorses. We should go. Storm's coming. Ginny looked at the heavy sky, then back at her trunk. It contained everything she owned now, a few dresses, her mother's pearls, and the family Bible she couldn't bear to leave behind. Reed followed her gaze. Without a word, he hefted the trunk onto the wagon like it weighed nothing at all. The ride to the ranch took hours, the wagon creaking along a trail that barely deserved the name. Ginny sat stiffly beside Reed, her hands clenched in her lap. The cold seeped through her cloak, through her dress, straight to her bones. You're from back east. It wasn't a question. Yes. Albany. What brings you to Montana? The question she'd been dreading. Ginny watched the endless white landscape roll by. I needed a change. Reed didn't press. Maybe he was used to people running from something. Maybe he didn't care. As they climbed higher into the hills, the wind grew sharper. Ginny's teeth began to chatter despite her efforts to stop them. Reed reached behind the seat without looking and pulled out a thick wool blanket. It smelled of horses and wood smoke. Here. Ginny hesitated, then took it. The scratchy wool was surprisingly warm. Thank you. He nodded, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. The sun was dipping behind the mountains when they finally reached the ranch. A cluster of buildings stood in a snow-covered clearing, a log cabin with smoke curling from the chimney, a barn that leaned slightly to one side, and a few smaller outbuildings. Beyond them, the land stretched out in frozen waves, dotted with dark shapes that must have been cattle. A boy of about 12 burst from the barn, his boots kicking up snow. Uncle Reed. You got the dash? He skidded to a stop when he saw Ginny, his mouth hanging open. This is Eli, Reed said. My nephew. Eli, this is Miss Blackwell. She's our new cook. Eli's eyes widened. She don't look like no cook I ever seen. Ginny felt her face grow warm. Reed shot the boy a look. Go tell Cookie we're back. As Eli ran off, Reed helped Ginny down from the wagon. Her legs were stiff from the cold and the long ride. She stumbled slightly, and his hand shot out to steady her. His grip was strong, his fingers rough against her arm. The cabin door opened and an older man stepped out, wiping his hands on a stained apron. He had a face like a dried apple and eyes that narrowed when he saw Ginny. "This her?" he called to Reed. Reed nodded. Cookie snorted. "Well, she better learn quick. I ain't cooking for no greenhorn forever." Ginny swallowed hard. The smell of something burning drifted from the cabin. Somewhere in the distance, a wolf howled. She had thought Albany society was cruel. But as she stood there in the gathering dark, surrounded by strangers in a land that seemed determined to freeze her out, Ginny realized she'd never truly known what hardship was. And Reed Colter still didn't know she'd lied. The inside of the cabin smelled like burnt beans, sweat, and wood smoke. Ginny stood frozen in the doorway, her eyes adjusting to the dim light. A cast-iron stove dominated one wall, its surface blackened from years of use. Rough wooden shelves held an assortment of dented pots and jars. A long table, scarred by knife marks and stained with years of meals, took up the center of the room. Cookie, the grizzled old man who'd greeted them, stirred a pot with more force than necessary. "Supper's ruined," he grumbled. "Ain't my fault you took so long gettin' back." Reed hung his hat on a peg by the door. "Miss Blackwell, this is Cookie. He's been keeping us fed since my wife passed." Ginny's stomach twisted. She hadn't known Reed was widowed. The way he said it, simple, matter-of-fact, made it sound like just another hardship in a life full of them. Eli tugged at her sleeve. "You really gonna cook for us?" "Cookie burns everything." "Watch your mouth, boy," Cookie snapped, but there was no real heat in it. Reed nodded toward a narrow door off the main room. "That'll be your quarters. Used to be my wife's sewing room." Ginny clutched her bag tighter. She had imagined a bunkhouse or maybe a corner of the kitchen. Not a room that had belonged to a dead woman. The silence stretched. "Well?" Cookie thrust a wooden spoon at her. "You said you could cook. Prove it." Ginny's palms went damp. She had hoped for at least one night to settle in, to gather her wits. But 4 pairs of eyes, Reed's steady, Cookie's challenging, Eli's curious, and even the old hound dog's mournful, waited for her to move. She set her bag down and reached for the spoon. An hour later. Smoke filled the cabin. Ginny coughed, waving a dish towel in front of her face. The stew she'd attempted, a horrifying mix of overcooked beef and undercooked potatoes, smelled like charred leather. Eli poked at it with his fork. "Is it supposed to be black?" Cookie cackled. "Told ya. City girls don't know nothing about real cooking." Reed said nothing. He just stood, took the pot outside, and dumped the contents into the snow. When he came back in, his expression was unreadable. "We'll have bread and jerky tonight." Ginny's face burned. She had failed her first test, and spectacularly. Back home, her incompetence would have been met with gasps and gossip. Here Reed just accepted it, like failure was normal. Like she was normal. After supper, Ginny sat on the edge of her narrow bed, staring at the walls. Reed's late wife had papered them with pages from old catalogs, faded pictures of dresses and hats, a ghost of the woman who had once lived here. A small mirror hung above a chest of drawers, and when Ginny caught her reflection, she barely recognized herself. Her hair was coming undone, her face smudged with soot. A knock at the door. "Come in." Reed entered, holding a lantern. The flickering light deepened the lines around his eyes. "You'll need these." He set a pair of work gloves and a faded apron on the dresser. "Breakfast is at dawn." Ginny twisted her hands in her lap. "I'm sorry about supper. I'll do better tomorrow." He studied her for a long moment. "Why are you really here, Miss Blackwell?" The question hung between them. Ginny could lie again, could spin some story about adventure or wanderlust. But Reed's gaze was too sharp, too knowing. So she told a piece of the truth. "I had nowhere else to go." Reed nodded like that was answer enough. "Get some sleep." When he left, Ginny blew out the lantern and lay in the dark, listening to the wind howl outside. Somewhere in the distance, a wolf cried. She had run from scandal, from shame, from a life that had crumbled beneath her. But as she stared at the ceiling, she wondered if she'd simply traded one kind of wilderness for another. The rooster crowed before dawn. Ginny jolted awake, her heart pounding. For a disoriented moment, she didn't recognize the rough-hewn walls or the faint smell of lye soap and old paper. Then it all came rushing back. The ranch, the failed stew, Reed's quiet question in the lamplight. She dressed quickly, fingers fumbling with the buttons of her plainest dress. The gloves Reed had given her lay on the dresser, stiff and unbroken. She hesitated, then left them behind. If she was going to do this, she would do it properly. The main room was already warm, the stove crackling. Cookie stood at the counter, kneading dough with practiced hands. He didn't look up when she entered. "Eggs need collecting," he grunted. "Chickens don't feed themselves." Ginny blinked. "Where?" "Barn." He jerked his chin toward the door. "And don't dawdle. Men eat at sunrise." The morning air was knife-sharp, the ground frost-crusted under her thin shoes. Ginny hurried toward the barn, her breath fogging in front of her. Inside, the warm smell of hay and animals enveloped her. A cow lowed softly in its stall. Eli popped up from behind a stack of feed sacks, grinning. "You lost, Miss Blackwell?" "I was told to collect eggs." His grin widened. "Ain't you fancy?" He grabbed a basket from a hook and thrust it at her. "Come on. Hens bite if you're slow." The chicken coop was a riot of feathers and indignant squawking. Ginny hesitated at the entrance, eyeing the beady-eyed birds. Eli plunged in without fear, shooing a speckled hen off its nest. "Like this?" he said, scooping up a brown egg and dropping it into the basket. Ginny took a deep breath and reached toward a nest. The hen pecked her hand. "Ow." She jerked back, shaking her stinging fingers. Eli giggled. "Told ya." Ginny squared her shoulders. She would not be bested by a chicken. On her second attempt, she moved faster, grabbing an egg before the hen could react. Triumph surged through her, until her foot slipped in the straw and she landed hard on her backside, the basket tipping. Eggs shattered. Yolk oozed between the floorboards. Eli's eyes went wide. Oh. Breakfast was a quiet affair. Ginny sat stiffly at the table, her hands folded in her lap. The men, Reed, Cookie, and 2 ranch hands whose names she hadn't caught, shoveled food into their mouths with single-minded focus. No one mentioned the missing eggs, though Cookie had shot her a look that said plenty when he'd served plain biscuits and gravy. Reed pushed back his chair. "Eli, show Miss Blackwell the milking stalls after." The boy groaned. "Do I have to?" "Yes." Reed stood, his gaze lingering on Ginny's hands. She curled her fingers self-consciously, hiding the red mark from the chicken peck. "You'll want those gloves," he said quietly, and then he was gone, the door closing behind him. The milking lesson went worse than the eggs. The cow swung its tail, flicking Ginny's cheek with damp hair. Eli laughed as she flinched. "You gotta squeeze, not pull," he said, demonstrating. A stream of milk hit the pail with a rhythmic ping. Ginny tried to mimic his motions, but her hands were too soft, her grip too unsure. The cow shifted, knocking the pail over with a casual swing of its hip. White liquid spread across the hay-strewn floor. Eli sighed. "Maybe you should stick to cooking." Ginny's throat tightened. Back home, she'd been praised for her embroidery, her French, her delicate watercolors. None of that mattered here. Here she was useless. That evening, she found Reed mending a saddle in the barn. The lantern light caught the silver in his dark hair as he worked, his hands steady and sure. Ginny hovered in the doorway. "I ruined breakfast. And the milking." Reed didn't look up. "Everyone starts somewhere. But I'm not," her voice cracked. "I'm not good at anything here." Finally, he set the leather aside. "You ever shoveled snow?" "What?" "Storm's coming. Path to the outhouse needs clearing." He nodded toward a shovel leaning against the wall. "Simple work. Just bend your knees and push." Ginny took the shovel, her fingers brushing his. His hands were rough, scarred. Hands that knew how to do things. She stepped out into the gathering dark, the shovel heavy in her grip. The first flakes of snow were beginning to fall. For the first time in months, Ginny Blackwell set to work without worrying who might be watching. The snow fell all night, piling up against the cabin walls and burying the ranch under a thick white blanket. Ginny woke to the sound of men's voices and the scrape of shovels against hard-packed earth. She dressed quickly, her fingers still sore from yesterday's failures, and stepped into the main room. The table was empty except for a single biscuit left on a plate. Through the window, she saw Reed and the ranch hands clearing paths between the buildings, their breath fogging in the cold air. Eli was struggling with a shovel twice his size, his cheeks red with effort. Cookie stood at the stove, stirring a pot of something that smelled like beans and bacon. He didn't turn around when she entered. "Men ate already," he said. "Left you something, though." Ginny picked up the biscuit. It was cold. "We're heading into town later," Cookie continued. "Need supplies. Reed says you're to come along." Ginny's stomach tightened. Town meant people. People meant questions. Why? Cookie finally turned, wiping his hands on his apron. "You need proper clothes if you're gonna work here. Those city dresses ain't fit for Montana winters." Ginny looked down at her skirt, the hem still damp from yesterday's misadventures. He was right, of course. But the thought of facing a town full of strangers made her hands shake. The ride to Silverton was quiet. Reed drove the wagon, his shoulders stiff under his heavy coat. Ginny sat beside him, bundled in a borrowed wool blanket that smelled like horse and hay. Eli perched in the back, kicking his feet against the wooden boards. The town looked different under a layer of snow, softer somehow. But the stairs were the same. As they pulled up to the general store, Ginny saw faces turn toward them, eyes lingering on her with open curiosity. Reed helped her down from the wagon. "Stay close," he murmured. The store was cramped and warm, shelves stacked with jars of pickles, bolts of fabric and tins of tobacco. A pot-bellied stove in the corner radiated heat, and a group of men sat around it playing cards. They fell silent when Ginny walked in. The shopkeeper, a thin man with spectacles perched on his nose, smiled at Reed. "Colter. Heard you hired a new cook." Reed nodded. "Miss Blackwell needs winter clothes." The shopkeeper's gaze slid to Ginny, taking in her fine gloves, the way she held herself. "Easterner, huh?" Before Ginny could answer, a woman's voice cut through the room. "Blackwell? Any relation to the Blackwells of Albany?" Ginny turned. A woman in a crisp blue dress stood by the fabric counter, her eyebrows raised. She had the sharp look of someone who knew everyone's business. Ginny's mouth went dry. Reed stepped slightly in front of her. "Just here for supplies, Mrs. Henderson." The woman's eyes gleamed. "I'm sure you are." She leaned toward her companion, whispering behind her hand. Ginny's face burned. She knew how this looked, a well-bred woman showing up out of nowhere, living under Reed Colter's roof. The rumors would spread faster than a prairie fire. Reed's hand brushed her elbow, guiding her toward the ready-made dresses hanging near the back. "Don't mind them," he said under his breath. But Ginny did mind. She minded the whispers, the knowing looks. Most of all, she minded the way Reed's jaw tightened when Mrs. Henderson's voice carried across the store. Such a shame what happened to that family. And that poor fiancé of hers. Ginny's vision blurred. She reached for the nearest dress, a drab brown thing made of sturdy wool. "This one," she said, her voice too loud. Reed studied her for a long moment. Then he nodded. "Eli, fetch some boots for Miss Blackwell." They left the store as quickly as possible, but the damage was done. As they loaded their supplies into the wagon, Ginny caught snippets of conversation from passers-by. "Heard her family lost everything. Left at the altar, they say." Reed's hand settled on the small of her back, steadying her as she climbed onto the wagon seat. His touch was firm, grounding. "You all right?" Ginny stared straight ahead. "I'm fine." The ride home was silent. Snow began to fall again, thick and heavy. Eli dozed in the back, curled under a horse blanket. It wasn't until they were nearly back to the ranch that Reed spoke again. "People talk," he said quietly. "Doesn't mean they know anything." Ginny clenched her hands in her lap. "They know enough." Reed didn't answer. But when they reached the ranch, he took her bags inside himself, leaving her to stand in the snow, watching the flakes melt against her new wool dress. Some things, it seemed, couldn't be outrun. Not even in Montana. The storm howled outside, rattling the windows and piling snow against the cabin walls until the world beyond seemed to disappear. For 3 days, the ranch was cut off from everything, No trails, no travelers, just the endless white and the creak of the house settling under the weight of winter. Ginny sat by the fire, mending a tear in Eli's shirt with clumsy stitches. Her fingers, once skilled at delicate embroidery, fumbled with the coarse fabric. Across the room, Reed worked on the ranch ledgers, his brow furrowed in concentration. The flickering firelight softened the lines of his face, making him look younger, almost approachable. Cookie banged pots in the kitchen, muttering about useless women underfoot, but even his grumbling had lost its usual bite. The storm had worn them all down. Eli sprawled on the rug, chin propped in his hands. "I'm bored," he announced for the 10th time that hour. Reed didn't look up. "Read your Bible." Eli groaned. "Ain't got one." That made Reed pause. He set down his pen and reached for the battered book on the mantel. "Use mine." Eli made a face but took it, flopping onto his stomach with exaggerated suffering. Ginny watched as he flipped through the pages, his lips moving silently. After a moment he frowned. "Uncle Reed, what's beget mean?" Reed's mouth twitched. "Means father." "Oh." Eli squinted at the text. "Then why don't it just say that?" Ginny bit back a smile. Reed rubbed his temples. "Ask Miss Blackwell. She's educated." All amusement fled. Ginny's needle slipped, pricking her finger. A bead of blood welled up, staining the fabric. She hadn't touched a Bible since before the scandal, since the days when she still believed God listened to prayers. Eli, oblivious, trotted over and thrust the book at her. "Here. Make it make sense." The leather cover was warm from the fire, the pages thin and worn. Ginny hesitated, then took it. Her father had read to her from this same book, King James Version, the words formal and heavy as old stone. She traced a finger down the genealogy in Matthew, the name she'd once memorized for Sunday school. Abraham begot Isaac, and Isaac begot Jacob. Her voice sounded strange to her own ears, rusty from disuse. Eli wrinkled his nose. "This is boring. Ain't there stories? With fighting and angels and such?" Ginny turned to the Psalms almost without thinking. "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want." The words settled over the room like a blanket. Even Cookie stopped his clattering. Outside, the wind still screamed, but here, by the fire, the verses wove a fragile peace. When she finished, Eli was asleep, his head pillowed on his arms. Reed watched her, his expression unreadable. "You read well," he said quietly. Ginny closed the book. "My father insisted on perfect elocution." A log shifted in the fire, sending up a shower of sparks. Reed leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "You don't pray anymore." It wasn't a question. Ginny stiffened. "How would you know?" "Saw you at meals. You bow your head, but your lips don't move." He studied her. "Figured you had your reasons." The truth clawed at her throat. She had prayed so hard when the scandal broke, begged God to fix things, to make the lies unravel. But the world kept spinning and her family's name stayed ruined, and her fiancé married someone else within the year. What's the point? The words came out harsher than she intended. Prayers don't change anything. Reed was silent for a long moment. Then he reached for the Bible, flipping to a dog-eared page near the back. "James says, 'Count it all joy when ye fall into divers temptations.'" Ginny snorted. "Joy. Not the same as happiness." His calloused finger traced the verse. "Joy's deeper. Lasts longer." She wanted to argue, to tell him he didn't understand, but the quiet certainty in his voice stopped her. Reed Colter, who'd lost a wife and nearly a ranch, who rose before dawn every day to work land that fought him at every turn. He knew about hardship. And yet he still prayed. The fire crackled. Eli sighed in his sleep. Ginny stared at the Bible in Reed's hands, the pages worn smooth by use. Maybe, she thought, faith wasn't about getting what you asked for. Maybe it was about holding on when everything else let go. The thaw revealed a rider coming up the trail, a stranger in a tailored suit that screamed money, his gelding too fine for Montana mud. Ginny watched from the garden patch, now slightly less pathetic after weeks of practice, as the man dismounted with the easy grace of someone used to being obeyed. "Reed Colter?" The stranger's voice carried across the yard. "Harlan Pike." We have business. Reed emerged from the barn, wiping grease from his hands onto his pants. Ginny noticed how his shoulders stiffened, like a bull scenting wolves. Inside, Pike made a show of brushing dust from his sleeves before slapping papers on the table. Your mortgage is in default. Bank's calling it due. Eli, peeking from the loft, gasped. Ginny's stomach dropped. She'd seen enough of her father's law books to recognize a foreclosure notice. Reed's voice stayed dangerously calm. Paid on time every month. Not according to these records. Pike smirked. Unless you've got $2,000 cash, this land auctions next week. Ginny's fingers itched to examine those papers. The numbers looked too neat, the signatures smudged. But when she edged closer, Pike snatched them up. No need to trouble the lady. His gaze raked over her work-roughened hands. Though you're not what I expected for Colter's new cook. Reed's knuckles went white on his chair. Leave. That night, Ginny found Reed at the pasture fence, staring at the moonlit hills. You knew this was coming, she said softly. He didn't deny it. Been fighting it since fall. Bankers in Pike's pocket. Ginny hesitated, then voiced the thought gnawing at her. Those documents looked forged. Reed turned, hope flickering, then dying. Even if they are, no lawyer within 3 days' ride. A gust of wind carried the scent of pine and impending snow. Ginny touched the fence post, the wood rough under her palm. This land had become her refuge. Now it was slipping away, and taking Reed's quiet strength with it. Ginny woke to the sound of axes. Outside, Reed and the hands were cutting timber, not for repairs but to sell. The rhythmic thunks echoed like a death knell. She intercepted Reed by the woodpile. You're giving up? His axe bit deep into a log. Doing what I can. But the forgeries don't matter without proof. He wiped sweat from his brow, leaving a streak of dirt. This ranch was my wife's dream. Failed her too. The raw admission stunned Ginny. Before she could respond, Cookie shouted from the house. Miss High and Mighty got a letter. The envelope bore an Albany seal. Ginny's hands shook as she read her cousin's scrawl. Pike's working with your ex-fiancé, they've done this before? Memories crashed over her. Her father's furious face when the embezzlement was pinned on him, Charles's slick assurances that he'd fix everything if she married him. The pieces fit too well. She found Reed inventorying tack in the barn. I know who Pike is. The words tumbled out. Charles's scheme, the forged documents, her father's ruined name. Reed listened silently, his expression hardening. When she finished, he said only, You lied about being a cook. Didn't lie about this. Ginny braced for anger. Instead, Reed lifted a dusty law book from a trunk, his wife's father's. Think you could prove it? The weight of his trust nearly buckled her knees. The town hall buzzed like a kicked hornet's nest. Pike lounged at the front, smirking as farmers muttered about bank tricks. Ginny clutched her notes, her corset tighter than a hangman's noose. Sheriff tapped the gavel. Colter, you got evidence or not? Reed stood. My cook does. The room erupted. A woman? Pike laughed. This ain't a sewing circle, darlin'. Ginny's pulse roared in her ears. Then she caught Reed's nod, steady as a mountain, and stepped forward. Exhibit 1. She held up Pike's documents beside samples of Charles's handwriting. Thank God for saving old letters. Note the identical flourish on the T's. Pike's smirk faltered. Exhibit 2. She cited property laws from memory, her father's lessons rushing back. Mortgage terms cannot be altered without. Enough. Pike slammed his fist. You'd take a Blackwell's word? Her family stole. Reed's chair screeched as he stood. Finish that sentence and we'll settle this outside. The sheriff examined Ginny's evidence. After an eternity he sighed. Bank'll need to review this. It wasn't a victory, not yet, but the auction was postponed. Outside, Reed caught Ginny's elbow. You were magnificent. Snowflakes caught in his lashes as he looked at her. Really looked like she was someone who mattered. Pike's voice cut through the moment. This ain't over, Blackwell. He mounted his horse, sneering. Funny how trouble follows you everywhere. The old shame threatened to rise. until Reed's hand found hers rough and warm. "Let it follow," he said loud enough for the whole town to hear. "We're ready." And for the first time Ginny believed it. Silverton's gossip mill worked faster than a runaway stagecoach. By Sunday service, every pew whispered about that Blackwell girl and her scheming ways. Ginny kept her head high as she walked past the church, but her nails bit half-moons into her palms. Inside the mercantile, women clustered like vultures. Heard her fiancé took one look at her true character and ran. Mrs. Henderson's stage whispered behind a bolt of calico. Reed's hand settled between Ginny's shoulder blades, warm as a brand through her dress. "Need more flour," he said deliberately loud. The bell jingled as Pike strode in, trailing cigar smoke. "Colter. Still keeping disgraced women? Or is she your—" Reed moved so fast Ginny barely saw it. One step, two, crowding Pike against the pickle barrel. "Finish that thought," he said softly, "and see what happens." The ride home was silent until Reed spoke. "They're wrong about you." Ginny stared at the passing pines. "Are they? I brought this on you." The wagon creaked as Reed turned onto the ranch road. Pike was coming either way. Only difference is now we know why. A gust of wind carried the scent of rain. Ginny studied Reed's profile, the stubborn set of his jaw, the gray at his temples. This good, steady man was risking everything for her. And she was going to ruin him. Ginny left at dawn. She folded her new wool dress on the bed. Reed's money didn't belong to her, and took only the Bible and a stolen biscuit. The note on the table read, "You'll get your ranch back without the scandal." The walk to town numbed her feet and her heart. The stagecoach agent frowned at her coin. "This ain't enough for Albany." "Anywhere east then." A hand slammed her money down. "She's not going." Reed stood there, hatless and breathing hard, his shirt damp with sweat. He must have run the whole way. Ginny's voice cracked. "You shouldn't. Don't." He gripped her wrist, not hard, but enough to feel his pulse racing against hers. "You don't get to decide what I sacrifice." The station walls blurred. Ginny hadn't cried when Charles betrayed her, when her father disowned her, but Reed's stubborn kindness undid her completely. He thumbed away her tears with calloused fingers. "Come home." And for the first time since Albany, Ginny had won. Spring came overnight. One morning, the creek shed its ice in a joyful rush, and the hills blushed green. Reed found Ginny in the garden, her skirts muddy to the knees. "Walk with me," he said. He led her past the barn, up a slope where wildflowers nodded in the breeze. At the crest stood a rough-hewn cross, his wife's grave. Ginny hesitated, but Reed shook his head. "She'd like you." The valley spread below them, the ranch small but thriving in the sunlight. Reed knelt, brushing last year's dead grass from the grave. "Mary always said this land was meant for second chances." Ginny's breath caught. Reed stood, pulling something from his pocket, a simple ring hammered from a silver coin. "Not much, but—" "Yes." She didn't let him finish. The wind carried the scent of earth and new beginnings as Reed slid the ring onto her finger. Below them, Eli hooped and tossed his hat in the air. He'd been hiding in the bushes the whole time. Ginny laughed through tears. This wasn't the polished proposal she'd once dreamed of. But it was real. It was hers. And when Reed kissed her, the past finally loosened its grip. The morning of the wedding dawned clear and golden, the kind of spring day that made it hard to believe the land had ever been buried under snow. Ginny stood in front of the small mirror in her room, their room now, smoothing her hands over the simple dress she and Eli's mother had sewn together. It wasn't silk or lace, but sturdy cotton dyed blue with indigo, the color of new beginnings. Outside, the ranch buzzed with life. Cookie had outdone himself, filling the long table with biscuits, smoked venison, and a cake that, while lopsided, was the closest thing to fancy the ranch had seen in years. The hands had scrubbed their faces raw and even tied ribbons around the necks of their least scruffy dogs. Reed waited for her beneath the pine cross at the hill's crest, his Sunday shirt freshly pressed, his boots polished to a shine. When Ginny stepped into the sunlight, his breath caught, just once, before he held out his hand. The preacher was a traveling minister, a wiry man who'd married half the territory. He smiled as Ginny took her place beside Reed. Ready? Ginny looked at Reed, at the quiet strength in his eyes, the way his thumb brushed over her knuckles. She thought of the long, hard winter, of burned meals and broken eggs, of whispered prayers and a man who'd loved her enough to chase her down. Yes, she said. The vows were simple. No grand promises, just the truth, to stand together, to work together, to love as long as they both lived. When Reed slid the silver coin ring onto her finger, it fit perfectly. Then Eli, bouncing with excitement, produced a second ring, a braided leather band. For you, Uncle Reed. Miss Ginny helped me make it. Reed's voice was gruff as Ginny slipped it onto his hand. Fits better than any store-bought thing. The celebration lasted well into the evening. Neighbors came from miles around, bearing pies and preserves and curious glances at the once fine lady who'd tamed Reed Colter. Ginny, who once would have wilted under their scrutiny, laughed as Reed spun her in an impromptu reel, her skirts flaring as the fiddle played. As the sun dipped below the hills, she found herself at the long table, surrounded by the people who had become her family. Cookie, grumbling about the noise even as he passed out extra slices of cake. Eli, sticky-fingered and grinning. The ranch hands, their rough voices raised in song. And Reed, always Reed, his hand warm on the small of her back, his eyes saying everything words never could. Ginny Blackwell Colter lifted her glass. The past was behind her. The future stretched ahead, wild and beautiful as the land itself. And she was finally home. Thank you for joining Ginny and Reed on their journey. If this story warmed your heart, please like, share, and subscribe for more tales of love, redemption, and second chances on the frontier.